I call it the pickup truck of the skies. All about the venerable Cessna 210 in this episode of In the Hangar. Welcome to In the Hangar. I'm Dan Milliken. In the Hangar is sponsored by Gold Seal, iFly GPS, and Wingfield Aviation. John Wingfield, the owner, actually owns a P210, which is what the subject of this show is all about. And there is no panel on the face of the planet that knows the Cessna 210 better than the guys I have here. I have Paul New, John Efinger, and Mark Zimmermann. These guys are writing the book on the 210, have been, and it's just amazing. Guys, thanks for being here. Let's start with Paul. Tell us about yourself and why you're writing the book on the 210.
Well, didn't intentionally set out to write the book on 210. It just happens. I own Tennessee Aircraft Services in Jackson, Tennessee. We specialize in 210 repair and have for many years, and it just kind of flowed into that. And we just enjoy the 210. It's a great machine.
All right. Cessna John Efinger. Am I the only one who calls you Cessna, John?
No, that's kind of happened over the years, and I don't know why, but I could tell you.
Maybe it's because you do nothing but Cessnas.
I don't work on other airplanes, and it just, it's come around the circle.
How have you become a renowned expert on the 210? How does that happen?
Yeah, I don't know about, a renowned expert end of things.
Okay, well, everybody else considers you to be
I do a lot of work on Cessnas, and I've just tried to focus on one model airplane, and it seems that I see a lot of retract aircraft every time I look out in the shop.
All right, very good. So let's, Mark Zimmermann. Mark, tell us about yourself and your experience with the 210.
Well, I've kind of backed into this thing as an airplane hobbyist that actually was interested in building airplanes, but ended up with a partnership in a 210 back when I was just a pup, and been throwing money at it ever since.
First off, the history of the 210. Why did Cessna come about to introduce this model to the market? Paul, what do you think?
Well, I think they were looking for something to compete with the Bonanza.
Okay.
And so they had a 182 and hooked it up with all sorts of contraptions to retract the landing gear. It barely worked. It did come down most of the time, and that eventually turned into the 210 in 1960. And it did pretty well against the Bonanza.
So it was basically an elongated 182, maybe widened just a little bit. Same engine as the 182 at that point, wasn't it?
It's not actually elongated. It's the same length.
It's the same
From
length.
the spinner to tail, it's the same length airplane.
That's right, because it was still a four-seater, wasn't it?
It was a four-seater, and the 210s today are the same length as the 182 and the 206.
I did not know that. Well, how did they get the extra two seats?
They just extend the portion of the airplane, more of it is cabin as opposed to tail.
So it's the same length. I did not know that. Wow.
Vertical fin and rudder, the same part numbers.
The six-seaters, I guess the Cherokee 6 was out at that time. Bonanza had their 6.
I don't know when the Cherokee 6 came out, but I think it was a little bit later. And the 210 wasn't a real six-seater.
Not until
about 1970.
Okay. All right, through the years, what were some of the improvements that they made on the models? I know that at some point they got rid of the wing strut, right? And the wing design is what's really unique to the 210.
In '67, they went to the cantilever wing, got rid of the struts, had about a 3-degree dihedral, and then in '70 they reduced that, or excuse me, '69 they reduced it to 1 degree. But the cantilever wing is arguably stronger than the strutted wing. It's a very different kind of dynamic under stress, but it's a faster wing. So you can get a cantilever wing 210 can get up into the yellow arc on airspeed much quicker than the older ones.
Okay, so for speed, that's what that gives. Now, of course, there's a lot of news about that wing design. You're saying that there's arguments for it being even stronger than the strutted, but there's been a new AD out on the wingspar after the Australia crash of a 210. John, what's this wingspar all about?
Well, a lot of that has to do with basic condition of the airplane. And you know, you could have the same problem in any kind of model aircraft has its weak areas. Any airplane with age, it's really the usage, it's got to do with the environmental conditions, and we just happen to have one that came out with a Cessna aircraft. Without getting too involved in the reasoning behind the whole AD push, you had an aircraft, basically it was used out of its category and utility, it was modified. Any airplane's going to have corrosion. So there was a setup of factors of age and the flight conditions it was utilized in, and it just exceeded its time life.
Do you think the AD was necessary, you personally?
Do I personally think it was? Yes and no. Yes, because there's some aircraft that really haven't been looked at over time, and they've been in poor condition for many years, and they need to be removed from service. If you've got an aircraft that's been maintained properly and it's being inspected regularly and it's not in the environmental conditions, it's a lot of expense for no real reasoning. It's not that it's going to be hidden, it's just hidden if the aircraft is not being maintained properly.
Well, and as far as I understand it, the earlier models, probably up into my model, which is a 1980 November model, the issue was there was a foam thing put around the wing spar so you couldn't visually see what was going on underneath, and also that foam could contain moisture. Is that accurate?
And that's part of the problem. Again, if it was stored outside, there is a little difference between the sealant up in the roof section and the roof skin. You know, I know Paul sees it all the time as well. The environment, if you've got an airplane that's been out in Arizona, it's been in a hangar all its life, it's totally unnecessary.
Okay.
If you got an airplane that's sitting out on the shores of New Jersey somewhere outside, or down in South Florida on the coast all the time, it's tied down on a ramp, then you're going to have corrosion. And these are some of the weak areas. And if they're not being looked at, it's never been looked at, you know, we get into that, you know, again, with Paul, we see it all the time where nobody has looked at that airplane in 20, 30, 40, 50 years in specific areas. So that's where having a little model-specific knowledge on the aircraft helps out a lot.
Yeah. The 195 also had the cantilever wing, and it's been a proven design. It's a good design, but any of these airplanes that are neglected are going to deteriorate. And it's, I hear a lot of guys wanting to put new glass in their airplanes and do these kind of avionics improvements, but if that airframe doesn't deserve that kind of expense and attention, it's all for naught. The focus for people getting into airplanes today is to see that they've got a, let's say, as close to a spotless airframe as they can get, and the only way they're going to get one is by having and this is kind of a segue into Paul here, take his course. Learn about the airplane before you start throwing money at it.
Okay, well, let's talk about that. Paul, I first learned about you because when I joined the Cessna Pilot Association, you know, I would see the notices about you having your, I think it's a 3-day all about the 210 course, which I always wanted to do. The timing never worked out. What's that all about?
Well, it was actually started many, many years ago by John Frank,
okay,
who started the Cessna.
Really wrote the book.
Yeah, he wrote the first book, I'll put it that way. And it's a 3-day event. We go through everything on the 210, all the systems. It's really a maintenance level class, but it's designed for aircraft owners. So we get down into the weeds a little bit, and you think, well, we could not go so deep into the weeds, but then someone in that class of 30 people would be unhappy because you didn't go deep enough, and others are unhappy because you go too deep, so you kind of find a middle ground. But it takes 3 days. I usually talk for about 9 to 10 hours per day.
Is that for current owners only?
Oh, no, it's for anybody. I really wish that prospective owners of a 210 would show up to the class. We always have at least one and as many as 4 or 5 mechanics that will come and take the class. Some owners show up with their mechanic to take the class, and I'm happy to do that because it's not that the 210 is special in that sense. It's just a machine. It's got parts like everything else. A recent customer of mine who just took his airplane home last week showed up. He wanted to bring the airplane to a specialist, and he said, my airplane's been maintained by the book. It's really nice. Well, the problem is the book was written when the airplane was built, and then it doesn't account for what happens in the last 40 years. Now, think about driving a 40-year-old car, how different it is to maintain a 40-year-old car versus a brand new car.
So like all the cars in Havana, Cuba,
right,
are kept by the book.
That's a perfect example. I love that. Right, so those people are having to do some extraordinary things. And John, Mark as an owner he gets the brunt of it because every time John has to go find a part for this airplane, sometimes it's available, sometimes it's at Textron, sometimes it's at McFarlane or someplace like that, and then sometimes it just isn't. And then you have to get really creative. Somebody has to deal with that. So, yeah, the class is the proverbial fire hose kind of class. You don't remember everything that goes on in the class, but take lots of notes, and it's pretty intense. It's a lot of fun. If you can handle listening to me for 30 hours, it's a good class.
Well, I've talked to people. John Wingfield has come out of it and just had great things to say about the class. So I definitely want to attend that at some point. You mentioned the Cessna being not really being special, but it is different. I learned that in my first year of ownership. I flew to cross country to New York City.
Everybody learns that in their first year of ownership.
Well, okay, so
and it's not model specific.
Yeah, and it's not model specific. But so I had a cross country for business. We had a shoot up in New York City, and I'm flying with the crew, and we're actually with one person, but we're flying at night. My first trip into the New York City airspace, and just as we're getting into New York City approach, my low voltage annunciator comes on. So I go ahead and divert to Allentown, Pennsylvania, right there at night, and everything else. But I remember landing, and I remember asking the FBO that was there, "Are you guys familiar with the 210?" "Oh yeah, we're good. We can handle 210s." Like, great. So I left it with them. Alternator belt had come off. That's the only problem. The alternator belt had come off. So I give them the deal. They're calling me the next day with all sorts of issues and trouble, and I'm not mechanically inclined as far as anyway. You know that from talking to me in a previous episode. But so he's telling me stuff that's going over my head. I just say, "Hang on," and I patch John in. John, do you remember that call?
Oh, well, yeah. It was
had
surprising to me as well.
Didn't they pull the whole alternator off or something?
They were ready to take the whole engine out of the airplane. I mean, it was.
My God.
I can't believe you were flying such an airplane.
So there's just a little bit of a trick to put the alternator belt on a 210, and that's where you multiply that by 1,000 of all the little tricks that you need to do to get a 210, and that's why it's great to hear that A&Ps are attending your class, because I want the A&Ps to know the little tricks.
This doesn't include those specialty tools to get in that hole down there just so that you can hold 2 or 3 clamps together. And
I mean, you guys have design tools,
yeah,
right?
but then again, on your airplane, it wasn't that it was that difficult a task, but you have air conditioning, you got a larger alternator. So everything isn't in the book that you have to work on, and this is where the whole model specific comes in. If you're familiar with the various airframe models and you know the specifics as far as what kind of kits and what kind of mods, and yours has got several different factors that change things up, and so they can't go in a book, and they and even if you had the book, it wouldn't have helped you in your situation. Right. But it's again, knowing a little details about the models that you're working on. I've said this before, we talked about this before. A lot of times if you go in a shop and you see a Piper, you see a Grumman, you see a Cessna, you see a Cirrus, you know, and a Citabria. Well, how many mechanics do they have, and how many of those guys are experts on the details of each model of those airplanes?
They're all going to be generalist.
Yeah. And that's where it gets expensive. And then just like when yours came back, you know, how much rework did I have to go back and do after it got
not only
back?
that, you know, and this is actually, you know, I'll own this as the airplane owner and not being where I needed to be. I didn't understand some basic stuff I needed to have taught myself. For instance, baffling. I didn't understand how baffling works. I do now, but we came back. Brought the plane back, and the first thing, when you pop the cowling, they had not, that little trick of putting the baffling correct when you put that last cowling on, and it had bulged the cowling where you screw it in.
Right.
You know, little things like that, that alone tells you those guys did not know how to work on a 210.
But then again, if you have the same person that's doing the maintenance on your plane, now that baffle seal's been modified since, you know, the original seal. And if you're familiar with an airplane, these guys that say, well, you need to go, you know, move mechanics all the time. Well, every mechanic's going to have their technique, and they're all going to have a little bit of knowledge of your airplane after they're done working on it.
Right.
So, you know, that
And if you're finding a new mechanic every time, you're starting over often every time. So that's probably,
and then that leads into just what we've talked about. You got a 50-year-old airplane. Well, that is not going to be like the same airplane coming out of factory. If you've got a new 182, for example, a new Cessna, those are going to be consistent. They're all out of the factory. They're all the same thing. If you've got an airplane, it takes a guy a couple years probably. I'd say, what, Paul, 2-3 annuals to really get familiar with the
Are you talking about the mechanic or the owner? Because it's both about the same.
Well, both. Yeah. It takes it pretty much both of them. It's going to take time, and about the third year, you'll see things you didn't see the first year, and about then you'll be familiar with, okay, this seal's been altered, but I could make this work, and as long as we make sure we tuck this in here. But then you take that same airplane from a guy that's familiar with working on it, you know, like how many years I've worked on yours for 15, 16 years now. And you go to another shop, I'm going to have to tuck everything back in and rework everything as it comes back. Just one maintenance event from one individual will throw all that out. So that's where you got to think about, you know, do you want to take it to different shops all the time and different mechanics? And on the same token, you might have the same mechanic for 40 years. Make the same mistake for 40 years.
Same mistake for 40 years, absolutely.
Well, in 40 years, we've learned a lot about new materials too. So, you know, there's new materials that weren't there when the book was written.
Well, and you think also your airplane, what year model?
1980.
1980, in model. So 1980, calculate how old the airplane is, how many different interiors it's had, how many different sets of radios it's had, how much of some of the old radio equipment may still be in the airplane. Well, you've been with John, so it's probably not the case. But most owners, when we see an airplane for the first time, whether they've owned it for 10 or 15 years, well, this last guy that I was talking about has owned his airplane for over 30 years.
Oh, wow.
And he was very surprised at the stuff that was found. But even new owners will show up for the first time annual, and we find connectors that don't go to anything and wires that are in odd places. Yeah.
Do you guys want to talk about avionics shops? Coming in behind an avionics shop?
We're not going to do that.
No, we don't have that much time. That's a whole other thing. But so not only is the airplane an antique, but it was complicated when it was built.
Right.
It's at least that complicated now. And the best part about the glass panels that people are putting in is that when I take out that big screen, I can get to everything that's back behind there. So I really encourage that everybody should spend about $100,000 on their 210 and get glass panels so I can easily take it out and do the inspection. I can get behind there to the rollers on the control yokes and all that. But it's a...
Well, also on that same line, if you go to the new panel like that, you could get rid of so much obsolete equipment in there if it's done properly.
Right.
We've
Or
seen
you
it
can
go
leave,
both
leave
ways.
most of it in and just
Yeah.
put the new stuff on top
Yeah,
of it.
you know, you see it done when you get a cheap, low budget quote. Generally, you know, I know we've both seen this, so it's kind of good that we get to share this together. But you'll see, you know, the 30 wire bundles, you
Right.
know, going back to the tail from the front of the aircraft
That no
that's
longer
just
connect
diked off and connectors hanging everywhere.
And
that
there's
old
still the
cane stack.
multicolor original Cessna 400 series.
And then they've got a
Now, don't
and
be
then they-
talking
and
bad
then-
about my 400B.
and they got a G3X in the panel,
Right.
You know,
Right.
And-
Well, I know that when I upgraded, shortly after I got my plane, you recommended Trevor for my avionics. I went up there and we got the transponder put in right before the mandate, and he pulled out. I have a picture of all miles of wiring all over the floor.
We've all seen it.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you this. On social media, here are some of the most common questions people wondering about a 210 and thinking about buying it. One question I get, I've heard the landing gear sucks. You know, how would you guys address that?
I don't think there's any issues. It's just like
Right.
they say, so many times we hear, get one with the doors removed. Why? You know?
Because there's one more
only-
complication that can fail. Or
There's
something.
only, you know, basically two more parts. There's two doors,
Yeah.
you know? Well, you know, with the gear lathe, there's four doors. But
Yeah.
but there's really nothing that you see go wrong with that, other than maybe if somebody's overspeeding the aircraft and they're deploying the doors at too high a rate of, you know,
The biggest
power.
problem with the landing gear, I think, is people maintaining them that don't understand, don't take the time to figure it out. Most mechanics, the generalists that John was talking about, work on 1, 2, 10, and they work on it once a year.
Right.
And when it comes in with that actually pretty rare landing gear problem, they're going to have to spend hours and hours trying to figure out how this system works before they can fix it. And they'll often just start throwing parts at it. And it's almost never hydraulic. It's almost always electrical. And it's usually really simple to troubleshoot if you understand the system. It's not the mechanic's fault. I get probably 4 or 5 calls a week from other mechanics and owners who have their airplane in for maintenance, and they're asking how to troubleshoot the landing gear system. And I'm happy to answer that, but if you're going to go to a generalist for your maintenance, you can expect to spend a whole lot more. You think that going to someone like John might be expensive because you travel the distance to get there, but the reality is getting it fixed efficiently the first time is way better than multiple trips to your local guy and still not getting it fixed.
Yeah. Okay, another question we see common with the 210, annual cost. What is an average, I see this question, it's always hard to answer, but what's an average annual cost
Wait, no,
for 210?
so I have to, I get real particular about how this question is asked.
I know.
First off, an annual always costs the same. It's
It's
depending on
the
where you go.
squawks.
Okay, so that's a whole different question. The annual is an inspection. That's it. The annual is not repairs.
Okay, good.
So the annual is an inspection, and then when that's done, set that aside. It's like you go to the doctor, and the doctor says, you have a brain cloud, but I don't fix brain clouds, so you're going to go to a specialist to get it fixed. You're going to pay for your doctor exam.
Okay, so it's like you go in for a physical.
You go in for
You're going to pay
physical.
for the annual physical.
All right, and that's it.
But you find out that you got cancer.
Right, so that doctor's not going to take care of the cancer. That's a separate event.
Right.
And it's really important that people get in their heads that an annual is an inspection. It doesn't, if you look in the minimum scope and detail, FAR 43, Appendix D, there's no servicing, not even an oil change is part of what the FAA says is an annual. So, sorry, I get on my little soapbox.
Right.
I can't help it. But an annual is an inspection. Now let's talk about the discrepancies. That's a whole different thing.
Well, so to help that person, what would you say to the guy who's thinking about buying a 210 and wants to budget for it? And should he budget $6,000 a year, $8,000, $10,000?
You can't put, all of these are so arbitrary. We're
I know,
we're on the
but the
same boat on
question
this
is a
thing.
common
All right,
question.
well, let's just back up to the annual, you know. Not all annuals are the same, okay?
Right.
As Paul said, you know, an annual is an inspection. Now, some people consider the annual, I'm just going to look at the airplane and I'm going to sign it off and I'm going to close it.
Drive
Now,
by.
you know, you cannot do a 100-hour annual inspection like by the Cessna manual in the time allotted. You know, this is taking your antique classic car and you're thinking that you're going to service that car and you're going to look at that car. It's going to come in the shop for a checkup just like it was brand new, you know, a one-year-old car. There's not a lot to look at on a one-year-old airplane.
But you can't see what you can't look at. So you've got 40-year grunge in those subfloors, and you can't find any hydraulic leaks that might be
Till you
there.
clean it.
Till you clean it, which is an extra. Yeah, that's not part of an annual.
You know,
Well,
so that's
fortunately, I
again
always give you my plane clean.
and all. Yeah, we'll talk about that on another offline. We'll talk
Offline.
about that one.
You found old French fries, I think, or
When no
something?
one's listening.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you know, not all annuals are the same, and then you also have to look at what's included with that annual. You know, if they're not going to service anything on that airplane, your annual is worthless at the end of the day because your airplane is going to be unreliable. You don't know how long it's going to go. And we've talked about it, of course, over the years and everything. And you know how we work things out with the owners, you know. And that's where it helps to have a relationship with your mechanic so you know what's expected. And an annual really should be your airplane is ready to fly 100 hours without any more maintenance, you know. Or if there is going to be any kind of intermittent problems or there's some kind of upcoming service or upcoming maintenance, be it tires or anything, you should know about it when you leave after your annual inspection. That's one of the,
Okay.
Yeah, a running
Probably.
squawk list. You keep a running squawk list, say, okay, these things are coming up, and we can forego these things this year, we'll catch them next year. Well,
and that's part of the pilot's responsibility too.
The pilot has responsibility here?
The pilot should be coming in and he should have a list in hand saying, this bulb didn't work,
Right.
you know, and not leave it up to the mechanic
To
to
find
find out the rheostat's backwards, you know, this light doesn't work, you know, I get this intermittent problem here, or this gauge, you know, goes intermittently in. It shouldn't be up, you know, you've got a checklist, and that's why I said 2-3 years probably to really learn the airplane, because there's a lot of problems, and if the pilot isn't giving you any input, they just want to get the annual, and I try to stay away from those jobs anyway, but.
Another thing, when you buy this airplane that you've been looking at, the seller didn't just decide today they're going to sell the airplane. They decided unconsciously probably 2 or 3 years ago, and that's when the maintenance stopped. So you're buying an airplane that's been neglected, probably not intentionally,
Right.
but you talk about the things that are
Oh
options.
yeah, I can buy.
Stuff
I
that
can
you
buy.
kick the can down the road.
For the price of a 182, the prices of 182 nowadays, I can get a P210.
Right. And then when you bring it to like our shops the first time and all these things have been neglected, or the mechanic doesn't know 210 specifically, and I'm sure John has a
$30,000.
Yeah, it's going to hit 30 grand or better right off the bat every time. And that's when we do an annual inspection. Then we provide a list. The owner-operator, Part 91-403 says that you are responsible for the airworthiness. It's not my job. That's your job. My job is to determine airworthiness. That's what an annual inspection is for. I determine airworthiness. I give you a list of, here are all the airworthiness items. Now, John and I may do this a little bit different. If I see there's 2 landings remaining on that tire, I'm not going to write that up as an airworthiness item because today, it's airworthy. It may not be airworthy tomorrow. If you have an AD that's due, you've got the ACS ignition switch, and it has to be 2,000 hour disassembling relube, and it's due 2 hours from now. Right now, it's airworthy. So it's not going to be on my airworthiness list. So there will be 40 or 50 items on the airworthiness list. It's very specific, not a lot of gray area. But then there's going to be the recommended list.
Squawk list.
You've got the airworthiness squawks. You've got the owner-reported squawks that John was talking about that hopefully you bring in, because we can't see that intermittent fuel gauge because it's sitting still in the hangar. But then there's this whole big recommended list, and that's where you come in. Okay. So you have to decide, do I want to do that AD 2 hours early, or is it, maybe it's not going to be due for 50 hours. I can do that today, or I can do it 50 hours from now. But so sometimes I will put things that a lot of people would call an airworthiness item. It will be an airworthiness item, but today it is an airworthiness item.
But you should be aware of that too.
Absolutely.
When you discuss what's going to be done with your airplane, that's where you come in.
Yeah.
And we're really talking about the same thing. I mean, you know what the squawk list is, every year. And mine generally starts out with the pilot squawk list, if they provide me a pilot squawk list.
This is why companies have flight departments.
Right. Well, and it's also important for people that are thinking about buying an airplane to think about, because that's a really good point. Everybody who buys one of these airplanes should be thinking in terms of it's been neglected, maybe not intentionally, for the last few years. So that's why a pre-buy inspection is so critical. But I don't want to get into that because we'll save that for another episode. But on the 210, one thing that's unique is that you have pressurized versions, you have non-pressurized versions. Is the pressurized pretty much just the same as the non-pressurized as far as maintenance?
Oh, day and night,
Yeah, I kind of tossed that up for you.
Yeah, well, that's going to be basically, I figure rule of thumb, it's about double the time to do anything. I don't know.
Really?
You'd say.
Right,
so
it depends. A real simple one.
If it's under the engine compartment, or if it's in the
explain what we're talking
airframe.
about. We're talking about double the time on a P model, a pressurized model.
For access.
For access.
The airplane is not much more complicated. The pressurization system only has, 4, 5 components. And they usually work really well for a long time. And then when they don't, then it's a problem, because there's only 1 or 2 places I know of that even work on the pressurization parts. But as John was saying, getting to anything, you add a heat exchanger under the cowling on the left side, so getting to that part of the engine is now very restricted. You've got more plumbing up front. The pressure vessel is now sealed everywhere, so just pulling floor panels up. The belly of the airplane is the pressure vessel from the firewall to the landing gear actuators. And then the floor panel becomes the pressure vessel. So all those inspection panels are sealed.
And every penetration.
Yeah, every penetration. All the avionics underneath your back seat that, by the way, you're on your 4th generation of avionics. So there's all these empty holes back there where screws used to go through. And all your pressurization air is just dumping right through all those holes. And that often gets missed. But the saddles that get loose when your landing gear comes, I almost want to say up into the down position, which they kind of do. There's this saddle block. It's got 4 bolts in it. I find this in pre-buys and in first-time annuals all the time. Well, on a non-pressurized 210, it's really not a big deal. You've got some suicide tools. You were talking about tools earlier. We have tools perfectly wonderful tools that we bend and mangle, and we have 2 special drawers for our suicide tools because they sacrifice themselves for this one application. So getting to those 4 bolts and positioning that saddle and torquing those bolts down, which they're loose, it's not a problem until you get into a P210. Now you have an access issue. You're pulling the rear door post cover off. You're digging out. I think in the original 210, there's a little inspection cover that's kind of down in a hole. And instead of brushing on sealant like they would in the fuel tank or everywhere else in the airplane, I think they just poured it in there. And some of them were 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch thick. And so the least experienced mechanic in the shop gets that job, probably named Hunter or something like that, and he just spend an hour or 2 just digging that out. So, and that's just for tightening up those bolts.
Wow. Okay.
Well, and then the repairs. Anytime there's a pressurization problem, it just seems like we'll just get another half gallon of sealant and pour it in there. So, you know.
In the wrong place.
And it's always on pulleys and moving parts and control cables and just covering up anything that you need to get access to. So you're going to spend half a day just scraping sealant, trying not to take the electronic component apart, digging it out from underneath the sealant.
What, is there an advantage to a pressurized? Obviously, you can go higher.
That's a pilot question.
Yeah, okay, so let's go. So let me ask that. Let me ask you this. Performance-wise, I've heard that because it's pressurized, you don't get as much performance out of the engine. Is that true?
I don't know about the
Takes longer to
performance out of the
climb.
engine, but you got a heavier aircraft.
That's why.
Well, it's basic weight is heavier. The gross weight's the same, still a 4,000-pound airplane. You do bleed off of the compressor, the turbo compressor for cabin pressurization, but you have a bigger turbo to do it. So you're still getting that 36 inches of manifold pressure or whatever. It's developing the same 300 and whatever horsepower. They do climb slow. The Turbo 210 also climbs slow, but I don't think people pay as much attention to it. When you're in a P210, you're often going to 20, 21,000 feet, and you can do 800-900 feet a minute for the first 10,000, and then you're down to about 500 feet a minute, and it takes a really long time, and you're thinking, it's only a 2-hour trip. By the time I get to 21,000 feet, it's time to go back down. Why do I have this?
Well, and then they're cool enough.
Right.
Yeah,
it's all about CHTs.
Yeah. And with the advent of the engine monitors, that's another issue that wasn't as big when these airplanes came out.
Yeah, you were all really happy because the red line was way over here and you didn't even know where it was. As long as you didn't hit it, you were okay at 460 degrees.
So with the P210 as well, this was, not only have you got the complex cabin, but when it came to marketing, they said, well, hey, could we put air conditioning in this plane? Engineers were sure, could we put a bigger turbo on this airplane? Engineers said, sure, and then the pressurization. And, I have a special arm that I put on when I work on the engine of a P210.
Is it a Kevlar glove? Oh, yeah.
and you'll come out of that like you've gotten a bobcat fight when you're, back on that whole maintenance thing, it just, you have to take off so many parts to get access to whatever it is you need to service. Like if you're trying to set just the fuel system.
The fuel system, right.
Just the fuel system, you take half the back of the motor apart. How many airplanes you got to take half the engine, the battery, the alternator to get into the fuel system. Right. Do a flight, get it hot, and then go back and do it again. So it takes a lot longer to work on them. So you can expect a lot more maintenance time.
Okay, so let me ask you guys this. We'll go around the horn. Your favorite thing about a 210? Mark?
I like the comfort.
Yeah,
I'm not rubbing shoulders like I am in a 182. I like the speed, although if I was flying the Concorde, I'd be trying to get another knot out of it.
Right.
It's just a comfortable airplane, and I think you're going to ask what I would change. I don't know that anything that I would change other than maybe the accessibilities of removing and reinstalling the center row seats. If there was an easy way to pop those in and out.
Well, you could buy a newer 210.
Yeah, mine only takes about 5 minutes. Is yours?
Well, you got to pull that little scab patch of the
because you've got an
rail.
L or an M.
I've got an M.
M. Okay. So all right. John, what about you? What's your favorite thing about the 210?
Just same with Mark. Of course, me and him fly a lot together and do the 210s. And like he said, the first time we jumped in a 182 together, we're like, how did this happen? This isn't very comfortable. So you got a lot more comfort in a 210. What I love about it, to me, it's the ultimate 4-place airplane because you could take one of the middle seats out.
I do.
You could have somebody on the back bench, and they could be
Stretching.
watching a video on an iPad or something, and if they get bored, they come up to the middle seat, and you always got somebody up front helping you out, and you could actually move around that cabin if you wanted to on a cross country. You know, we do trips, and of course we've got, you know, that other middle seat that's out. That's for the ice chest and you know, all the condiments while we're flying. You know, the cheese and the smoked chicken
or the piddle pack.
Yeah, well, that's how you get the French
you
fries down in there that I.
Well, we're going to talk about that another time again.
What would you change?
I don't think I would change a whole lot on it. There are some improvements on them now. The 6-point engine mount is just, you know, the best modification that there is to it. You know, there's better exhaust systems. There's the 6-point engine mount is probably the biggest item I could think of there. And now, of course, there's transplant engines now, and you could put the tuned induction new Continental 550 engine, and now you could get that with a turbo. So those are probably some of the better improvements to the airframe. There's really not a whole lot more you can do to that. I prefer personally the gear doors on the airplane. It keeps things cleaner, and it just looks good. if you're in another airplane, that is, you know, and looking over at it. But I think the gear doors, I prefer that because it keeps things clean. It keeps the subfloor clean. It keeps all the tunnel sections clean. So anytime you can seal up the airframe, that's a good thing in my book.
And taking the gear doors off doesn't solve the problem that taking the gear doors off was intended to solve. The solenoid, what controls the gear doors and all the switches and stuff are still there. So when you had gear doors and the gear cycle didn't complete, the gear doors would be hanging open. You'd look out in the mirror and realize, oh, the gear system hasn't completed its cycle, and that's part of what you tell your mechanic. Without the gear doors, all you know is the pump's still running and the gear's up. Why is this happening?
Or it blows the breaker.
And the breaker trips.
Something burning,
yeah, that's right.
You know?
So basically what you've done is eliminated the evidence of what the problem is.
And so your favorite thing about the 210?
The P210 in particular is you can fly that 4-hour trip and arrive where you're going and feel rested because you've had oxygen the whole time. The turbo 210s, I typically don't like to fly above 12. I'm old enough now that it's like when I get where I'm going, I am just tired. And I've done nothing for the last 4 hours but sit, but I'm tired. But in a P210, it's not, you don't have that feeling. It's, if you're comparing a Bonanza or Cirrus to a 210, those are sedans and the 210 is an SUV. So when you get in it, it's not going to be all sporty feeling and everything, right. But you can take yourself, your friends, your golf clubs, and you can go a really long way and be ready when you get there. Yeah. It's an amazing airplane. I don't know, it would have been nice if Cessna had decided to continue building it, yep. But I think the liability cost was just too high.
Yeah, I agree. I took my 210 with 4 of us to Connecticut twice from Texas. Mm-hmm. So with all the production gear and everything else. So I totally agree. Well, guys, I really appreciate you guys coming on and talking about the 210. I think that hopefully people have found some useful information. I know they have. I know I have. So thank you guys for coming. Really appreciate it.
Hope we didn't discourage too many people.
Well, I think a realistic expectation is a good thing. So
that's right.
It's a great plane. All right, everybody, thank you for watching. If you have some comments about the 210, please leave them below. And as always, like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. We'll see you guys next time in the hangar.